The last part of the first class will touch a very sensitive topic. We are talking about the architecture in between 1920 until 1950, which it means across the Second World War, and when in Europe was growing the two main dictatorships, the fascism in Italy, led by Benito Mussolini, and the National Socialist Party, led by Adolf Hitler. This is a sensitive point because the history is extremely extremely against this historical situation. It caused big losses of human life, and the economy was basically destroyed because of the situation. An important fact to discuss is that the two dictators, Mussolini and Hitler, were very controversial persons. Fortunately, in this discussion, we are not talking about politics or the history of the regime. We are just touching the consequence of these two regimes on architecture. So the first question that we have to face is, there is any architecture of the regime? There is any architecture of this dictatorship? The answer is very difficult because it is partially yes and partially not. What does it mean? It means that the key architect which was involved in the regime, in Italy, for example, Giuseppe Terragni, Adalberto Libera, and also Luigi Moretti, they were at the same time deeply involved in the regime, but at the same time they are great architects. So somehow their work, it is a expression of an extremely talented artist, but at the service of the regime. This is a very sensitive point. At the same time, Albert Speer was much less talented than the Italian personality, but it was a great organizer, really a remarkable genius in terms of organization and management of his work. He was not only the architect of Hitler, but he was also the responsible for the all industrial production during the phase of the war, Second World War. So we are talking about people who know very well their job. They are great personality, but the controversy lie inside the fact that they were supporting the regime in Italy and in Germany. But we are going to touch only the quality of their architecture, and this is our interest. We have to remind that at the same time, the architecture of Terragni, Adalberto Libera, but also Figini Pollini, Luigi Moretti, Albert Speer, all those great personalities are not completely original and obedient to the regime. Marcello Piacentini in Italy were much more close to rhetoric and austere expression of the will of Benito Mussolini. I choose intentionally a key personality with a high quality of work because those people, yes, obey to the regime, but at the same time they create an architecture which was perfectly along the development of the modernist architecture and the purist architecture at that time. So somehow the work of those personalities was at the same time partially following the debate and the trend around the world, purism, functionalism, rationalist, modernist architecture, but at the same time has a sort of monumentality, a sort of rhetoric sometimes, which obey to the Mussolini and Hitler will. Probably one of the best architects in all this group is Giuseppe Terragni. Giuseppe Terragni is the prototype of the genius. His work is absolutely remarkable. The quality of the composition is extremely high. We can touch the originality of his work. We can touch the quality. His composition at the same time are extremely monumental, but very sober and with a sort of dynamic. It is always a surprise to investigate the architecture of Giuseppe Terragni. One of his first work is a residential building in the city of Como in Italy, named Novo Comum, and the meaning is New Como. It was a programmatic building. We have to remember that in the province of Italy, in the small city of Italy, the architecture was extremely traditional. The rationalist architecture, or functionalist, or purist architecture, as we described in the previous class, in the previous discussion, was not very popular. There is a very interesting story on the back of this Novo Comum. At the beginning, Giuseppe Terragni proposed a completely different project, very monumental, very rhetoric, deeply obedient with the regime, something like a neoclassic, but is a kind of form of neoclassic which is in between a rationalist and neoclassicism, but really, frankly speaking, very ugly. But it was the trick of the genius. He presented this work, they started to build the work, but then finally what happened is the final realization was completely different, and it is the work that you can look in this picture. So instead of a very monumental building, what appears is a very modernist and advanced building. What is very interesting at the same time is the relationship in between the Novo Comum made by Giuseppe Terragni and an avant-garde building made in the socialist Russian, made by one architect named Golosov. You can see the comparison in between the two projects. They are very not similar, but Giuseppe Terragni take inspiration from Golosov. Again, it's not a copy, but it's simply an inspiration, and this is quite common in the world of architecture. What it is very interesting in this project is the combination in between a very rigid block, a parallelepiped, but where the corner were empty, and there is a opposition in between curve corner and the top of the building, which is 90 degree. So the volume is very well defined, but at the same time, the volume itself was denied by the curve. This is a really interesting work if we consider that Giuseppe Terragni here were very, very young, in his 20s. So you can understand that the quality of architecture and the talent of the master is very show himself from the very beginning. One of the most important building in the career of Giuseppe Terragni, but I have to say in the whole history of the rationalist architecture in Italy, is of course Casa del Fascio, also in Como. This building is simply perfect in terms of quality of the space, composition, three-dimensional facade. The volume is very simple. It is rectangular, but all the facades are different. Giuseppe Terragni designed not only 4 different facades, but completely different logic, side to side. Many analyses were made on this building. There are very precise mathematical ratios inside. All the facades are three-dimensional, which is a typical element of the avant-garde architecture at the time. So no more a flat facade, but a dynamic facade. This three-dimensional facade generates dynamism. The idea, the composition of the windows is very different in between each other. Also, and this one generates a sort of, dynamism. But probably what it is the most important aspect of this building, it is not, it cannot be appeared by the picture. You have to visit the real building. What it is very special is the building is simply perfect in terms of size. It is perfectly at the human scale. The architect was able to create a building which is not too big, not too small. It is what it is called in architecture human scale. The sense, the proportion, the distance, the height. There is no any mistake. And this is one of the reasons why we consider this building one of the masterpieces of the rationalist architecture. Now the question is this building fascist? We can't say so, because generally speaking, the official architecture of the regime, for example, Marcello Piacentini, is much more rhetoric, it screams the power of the dictatorship. Not in this case. In this case, we are in front of a building which is behind any form of rhetoric. It is simply a perfect building in terms of every aspect we want to consider. There is another building that by Giuseppe Terragni that I want to mention. It is one building made in 1937, just before the Second World War. And in this case, we are in front of a building which is perfectly in line with the development of architecture in Europe. It seems a building made by Le Corbusier or Mies van der Rohe, and with a very high quality. Typical white volume, purist form, simple design, with some element of dynamic, something like the small roof on the top, but the simplicity and the elegance of the building express another great masterpiece of Giuseppe Terragni. A second great architect that is not very well known outside Italy, it is Adalberto Libera, who made a series of very simple but very elegant projects during all his career. He started also very young to design some small villa, small residential building in Roma. This villa, for example, it is characterized by a very simple volume, very unusual balcony, but very elegant. The last floor presents a balcony which is empty. So it's a kind of play with the image of the boat. This is not unusual. In many cases, in many architecture of that time, there is a very precise, a clear intention to imitate the machine. We remember the famous sentence from Le Corbusier, the architecture is a machine for living. This is why very often the architects were inspired by the mechanism, by the train, by the boat, especially boat. For example, there are many projects made by one Italian architect named Busiri Vici, and the inspiration of the boat, ship, was constant. In this case, it's the same. It looks like a very simple cube, but the back of the building, which cannot be displayed in this class, it looks really like a boat. This is another example. Again, we can see some details, something like the lateral balcony, which looks like some element of the boat, of the shipping. And the building is very solid, but also very elegant, with a form, the balcony are curved. And this small element, this small detail is very important in my personal opinion, because it shows one character which was very diffuse, especially in US, and this kind of character work was called streamline. Streamline was old architecture which was very fluent. It looks like cars, they are inspired by the aerodynamic. So there is always a continuous relationship, inspiration in between architecture and machine, architecture and mechanics, and this is one of the cases. Another very important building, it is a cover for another residential building, and this is a vault, extremely light, made by concrete, and it shows again the elegance and the quality of the architecture of Adalberto Libra. This is the famous Palazzo dei Congressi in Eur, made for the exhibition in Roma in 1942. On the opposite of the previous work, this architecture is a little bit more rigid. But the dome above the upper cube, it's also very light and very elegant. It is a masterpiece of engineering because it is has only 4 feet, and all this light dome fly on the cube. It is also a very remarkable building. Figini e Pollini, they are a partner in architecture, and they become very famous, and they are very remarkable architects along all the 20th century. They started during the 1930s to create their own projects. This is one small villa, and again we find the same composition which was typical at that time. We find similar appearance, similar logic, similar form, volume, language in Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, and Giuseppe Terragni. Figini e Pollini become very popular for the quality of their architecture. And this quality was even more interesting after the Second World War. During the period of the war in 1942, it starts a very important trend which become even more stronger after the war, after the Second World War, which is the workers' house or factories by important entrepreneur from Italy. Olivetti is one of them. Olivetti created one of the most important factory for typewriter and calculator machine. And his idea is to create a great machine, very functional, but with a very special design. So it was not anymore only functional machine, but functional plus beauty. So he created a line of great typewriter, a great calculator, mechanical calculator, of course, because at that time there is no electronics, and he was very successful. Because of his success, he had the intention to create a sort of harmony in between living condition and working condition. This is a typical of the 19th century socialist community, something like the Phalanstère around the world. So the factory were not only place where to work and suffer, but Olivetti create also houses with a high level of standard for the workers, and this is one of the case. This trend become even more clear after the war. But we always find in this preliminary project in 1942 a very high-level design for factories and residential building. This architecture is definitely rationalist, following the idea of Gropius that we have seen in the previous lesson. So glass facade, simple volume, very good function, very rational approach for the composition and the function, but in this case we have something more, a relationship in between factory and residential building for workers. This trend happened also in Germany, for example, with the company named Siemens. There are several Siemensstadt, so a city of Siemens, where the workers live very close to the factory in a very good apartment, considering the standard. Many other buildings can be quoted by Figini and Pollini, but we need to jump to another architect, which is very controversial in this case, and we are talking about Albert Speer. Albert Speer was the official architect of Adolf Hitler in Germany, and his work is simply rhetoric. The quality is controversial. We cannot say that it is a beautiful architecture, but it is the expression of the hypertrophic personality of Hitler. The dimension is simply out of scale in any case. It's big, that's it. Nothing more than big. It is a sort of neoclassicism, which it means it takes inspiration from the classic architecture from the past, but the quality is simply out of the discussion of the rationalism. It is not a rationalist anymore. It is a sort of neoclassicism or hyperclassicism. The dome of the Volkshalle is simply immense. Every aspect of the architecture of Albert Speer was simply out of dimension. Personally, I visited several buildings of Albert Speer. You can't understand. The human being simply can't understand the dimension. It is too big, but not only big, it is simply out of scale. It is out of the human conception. And you can see the size of the building from this picture compared with the super block just behind it. If you notice the size of the dome and the size of the road, it is simply insane. And we are talking about a big road, big building around, but this is simply bigger than anything else. This is a very famous project of Speer, made under the supervision of Hitler, for the Berlin capital of the new country named Germania. Speer redesigned Berlin in a form of immense and rhetoric city. You can compare, for example, the size of the building here and the traditional city on the left and on the right of the picture. It is simply immense. The scale is not human anymore, and is a big mistake. This is the Nazi Party rally ground. It is a series of facilities for the Olympic game. And again, we find this extremely simple and cold design, somehow even attractive, but it is a sort of perversion. It's not really warm architecture. It have to represent the greatness of the Nazi Party, and that's it. So definitely the critics consider Albert Speer in a negative point of view. This is quite clear in the history of architecture. Another very important architect we need to mention is Luigi Moretti, also from Italy. Luigi Moretti is another very peculiar architect. He's another real genius. All his work is unusual. According with some scholar, like Franco Porini, he is the first one who introduced the idea of the deconstruction in architecture. Why deconstruction in architecture for Luigi Moretti? Every work of Luigi Moretti is very peculiar. If the rationalist architecture, the purist architecture, is based on pure volume, compact form, definitely dynamic space and dynamic facade, in the case of Luigi Moretti, the composition appears quite broken. For example, if we look at the house, very famous building named Il Girasole, the sunflower, we find that the facade is almost classic. There are very regular facade, squared, but it is broken in the middle. On the top there is also a broken part, and the two facades are not on the same plane. One is behind the other. Also, the plan is quite unusual. It is a very, it is open like a sort of animal. This solution is a functional to get more light, more lighting in the rooms. The inner courtyard is empty. There are some unusual curvy element in the composition. This is typical of Moretti. Moretti sometimes generates a sort of architecture which is in between rationalist architecture and expressionist architecture. Some project that we published many years ago show a very unusual form. It is a curve. It's a curving. Curve facade, unusual composition, and this is one of the character of Luigi Moretti, which is very original. Luigi Moretti was definitely attached by the fascist party in Italy, and but he continued his career also after the Second World War with some real masterpiece of architecture that unfortunately we cannot go deeply in the analysis. A completely different personality is Giovanni Michelucci, one of the most remarkable and important architects in Italy, who lived 100 years old. He became very famous in Italy because he won the competition of the railway station in Florence. The design is definitely a typical rationalist architecture at that time, with some form of dynamism. The quality of the space is also very high, because the size of the building, like in Giuseppe Terragni, is also very, very human scale. Not too big, not too small. There are some interesting solutions of engineering, very high quality of the space, very high quality of design. But one of the most remarkable projects is in the post-war period. This is a church, church of San Giovanni Battista along the highway in Italy, near Florence. It is a very beautiful piece of art. It is a sculpture. The composition is very special. But what Giovanni Michelucci mentioned is when Le Corbusier visited this building, Le Corbusier was very impressed by the quality of the space. And this is true. If you visit this building inside, the quality of the light, the quality of the space, the unusual structural system, it is really impressive. It seems like a rocky forest, a forest made by concrete. Again, the space is very, very well designed. It is a human scale. It is a typical expressionist architecture. And what it is very interesting is Giovanni Michelucci was able to switch his design from a very rationalist composition to this building. This building is much later, it is 1960s, but so much later than the railway station in Florence. But it seems made by a completely different person. This is another building made by Giovanni Michelucci, Santuario della Beata Vergine della Consolazione, and again we are in front of sculptures. Also the composition of the facade is basically rocky. It seems like a rock. This church, it is curved. The structural system is quite complex, and the structural system is also very advanced. Again, we are in front of sculpture and space. La Chiesa di Longarone is another case. In this case, it is even more complex because there is a sort of audience for people on the top of the building. So the church is divided into levels. The ground floor, which is the church itself, and on the top there is a sort of auditorium which is open to the mountain in the surrounding. The quality of the sketch of Michelucci was really impressive. This is a typical architecture of the expressionist. Another building very important, it is in Colle Valdelsa, and it is a bank. This is another very important project because it is a very interesting composition in between rocks, or better marble, and steel frames, steel structures. It looks like a sculpture again, but this is the feature of Giovanni Michelucci. Some other sketch will show the visionary system of Giovanni Michelucci, which is in between utopia and realistic architecture. In my opinion, this is one of the most impressive and not very well-known architect. Then we have to discuss about other two personality, very important. This section of the lesson, it is not only focused on the architecture of the regime, is not focused on the architecture of the war, but also the architecture of the post-war. One of the most important architects in the history of 20th century, it is definitely Hans Scharoun. Hans Scharoun has a very special destiny, because Hans Scharoun was the youngest architect in the avant-garde period in Germany, and he survived to all of his masters. He started to build architecture when he was very young, and his style was an unusual rationalism. Why unusual? Because at the same time it is a typical rationalist form, white volume, simple form, functionality on the extreme level, but with some element which is typical of the expressionist architecture that we described in the previous section of our class. In this case, we find some very unusual composition, something like in the Smink house made before the Second World War. During the Nazi Party, the National Socialist regime, Hans Scharoun basically loses his job because he dared to build a house which was not considered nationalist, which was not considered traditional German. And in fact, it is very clear from this kind of plan. His architecture was very dynamic. The outlooking is not very explosive, it's not really unconventional, but the quality of the space and the plan was always something different compared with the rest of the rationalist architecture. This is why Hans Scharoun is considered expressionist architect. So the picture seems to be very banal, very simple, nothing very special. It looks like a normal house, but once you visit the building themselves, then something different appears. It is a very, very special, very different compared with the other rationalist architecture at that time. During the Nazi Party, we said, Hans Scharoun lost all his commission. He was basically jobless. And he started to design what it is called the sketch of resistance. And this is one example. It was visionary, completely artistic, no possibility to build. And this is why it was considered piece of art and not real architecture. But those sketch was the basis of every development after the Second World War. A common point in all these sketch of resistance is the creation of the house for the human being. It's a kind of big hole for the human being. What Hans Scharoun loved to repeat is Mensch ist gut, which in German means the human beings are naturally good. The spirit is good, the nature of the human are good. And he intended to create this kind of huge building for the human being, a kind of place where all the human with a goodwill are together to celebrate the great quality of our nature. This is quite important because many buildings after the Second World War, something like the theater in Kassel, has exactly this intention, to create not only a theater for performance, but a place where the people are together and show their unity in front of a theatrical performance. What it is very special in Sharon is the unusual plan. It looks a madness on the first glance. It looks something like completely out of understanding. It seems even insane. But on the contrary of the first appearance, the rationality of the composition is absolutely unique. There is no any small mistake. I personally discussed with one of his employees, who was already very old when I was young, when I was a student in university. And is the guy who designed the Marl-Schule, one school building in the city of Marl. And what he mentioned to me that Sharon hesitate and discuss hours and hours of every single detail during the design. Nothing is random. The deep analysis of the plan could show you something very, very logic and very, very rational. So it is not emotional, it is not madness, it is not a sculpture, but it is an unusual answer for common problem. It is simply original. It is different from any other architect. Every single choice, every single result, it is caused by a very deep investigation of the functional problem. Definitely, the appearance is different. And this is the great quality of the architecture of Hans Sharon. From outside, nothing special. A very common building, nothing very attractive. There is no good outlooking because the whole quality lie in the space of the building. This is the picture of probably the masterpiece of Hans Sharon, the Philharmonie in Berlin, made in 1956-1963, and it is one of the most perfect auditorium for music in the world. The acoustic is simply perfect. The space is very, very special. I visited this building several times, and I warmly recommend for all of you to visit because it is simply astonishing. The space is perfect, once again, exactly like in Giuseppe Terragni, the same like in other great architects that we have investigated in the past class. The very last author that I want to introduce you in this fifth and last lesson on the modernist architecture are two German architects named Fehling and Gogel. They are they're not very well known outside Germany, but they are very special. They are typical expressionist architecture, but with a very solid base on rationalism. They start with a very small pavilion in Berlin, very simple, very streamlined, but it is also very modern. Even today can be considered an advanced design. Very simple. In terms of space, a very nice church. This is a picture of a very nice church also in Berlin, made in 1960-1963. Again, expressionist architecture, but also with a very strong functional element. So this class concern the discussion about what happened during the Second World War and during the regime in Italy and in Germany, and then what happened just after. Those buildings appear broken. Fehling and Gogel, for example, in the Max Planck Institute in Berlin, made in 1965-1974, create a sort of broken organism. If we look the stairs, the space are really deconstructivist, we can say, even if the deconstruction appear only 10 years later. But this is the spirit of the expressionism. If we look at the complexity of the space, the complexity of the round plan, according with the definition of Adolf Loos, here we really reach the top of the investigation, of the research on the space. At the same time, those buildings are not capricious. Once again, they are building for education. This is the Max Planck Institute, and this is another picture. This picture shows the stair in the European Southern Observatory of Greichen, and so it is building that everyone can use. It is a research center based on a research center for science, and what we want to remind here is rationalism, expressionism are joined together in some unusual but very, very good design. So this is what we want to remark. This lesson is quite complex because we start from the architecture of the 18th century, the big revolution in terms of engineering, and then finally we will touch the development of the modernist architecture with Frank Lloyd Wright, Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, Walter Gropius, then the architecture during the Second World War, and then finally what happened just after the war. Some element of the rationalist architecture and the expressionist architecture, but also the organic architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright, continue before and after the war in a sort of continuity. But something happened around 1950, and this is the topic of the second class.